to our next Bilateral Bytes session. I'm Tanya Spisbah, the Director of the Australia-India Institute in Delhi. Today we'll talk about trusted partners and technology in the 21st century, cybersecurity. This is a timely topic, with the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison having addressed the nation on Saturday that Australia had been subject to cyber attacks from a national aggressor. And in the last few days, India has also reported almost 40,000 cyber attacks allegedly from Chinese hackers. Positively, earlier this month, the Australian and Indian Prime Ministers signed a framework agreement to collaborate on cybersecurity. And in this context, we're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Jaijit Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya is a noted expert in technology policies and technology-led societal transformation. He is the president of the Centre for Digital Economy Policy Research. Previous roles include head of the Centre for Fourth Industrial Revolution in India from the World Economic Forum, and also former head and partner of economics and policy practice at KPMG. He is a recipient of the APJ Abdul Kalam Award for Innovation in Governance. Dr. Bhattacharya is also an adjunct professor with IIT Delhi and is a long-standing friend of the Australia-India relationship, having accompanied President Kovind to Australia in 2018 and is a regular advisor to the Australian High Commission in Delhi. Jaijit, it's really a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure completely, Danya.
So you have worked extensively on the Indian digital economy and creation of a larger manufacturing and services ecosystem based on non-discriminatory policies. You've also presented at prestigious defence forums for the Indian Army to enable defence officers, academia and industry to understand requirements of and solutions for tactical battle areas, which includes cyber challenges during wartime and other cyber attacks and digital issues. With the COVID pandemic now, we are relying on digital communications now more than ever before. 5G and its outstanding functions like wide bandwidth, high speed, very high density wireless communication and small delays will be the pillars of the digital economy to come this century. At the same time, though, we know that we are going to experience even greater vulnerabilities than before, and this requires us to build stronger cybersecurity foundations. So what are your views on what India's approach should be first, and could Australia and India potentially work together in this space?
So Tanya, you're absolutely right that 5G is transformational, and obviously both of us are stating the obvious that everyone knows. But let's just look at it from the lens of the vulnerability that 5G brings in. Mind that the most potent toxins are the neurotoxins, are toxins which impact your nervous system. And that is where a technology like 5G fits in, because it's basically getting embedded into the communication network of any country. And it's not just any ordinary communication network we're talking about. 5G is going to connect everyone and everything. Starting with your speakers right now, which are connected, it will connect your cars, it will connect your pen, it will connect everything that is out there. And therefore, any compromise on the 5G network can completely bring a nation down to its knees. And in the olden days, you would have the forts being built, and then we had the trenches being built. And now, in a potential warfare, what adversarial countries can do is actually build compromised networks into your country. And that is a new trenches that we have. That's a new digital fortress that we are putting into the adversary's country. And that's what we need to be extremely careful about, both in terms of state actors and in terms of non-state actors. And in a country as large as India, or a country like Australia, which is so dependent on connectivity, given the size, the physical size of Australia, it becomes very critical that as we start adopting 5G in a very large manner, we need to, in parallel, start thinking of security and not as a post facto retrofit to the network. Otherwise, we'll end up quickly compromising our nations in a manner which will be very difficult for us to come out unscathed from. Also, if you notice, Tanya, in the larger geopolitical situation, the theaters of warfare have moved from land to water to air and space, and now cyber is one of the most critical areas of conflict that we have out there. Now, if you're not able to protect the cyber, and by 5G getting into and enabling cyber, if you're not in a position to be able to significantly have the protection level in the cyber world, then we are absolutely compromising our nations from a plain cyber attack, from warfare happening in the cyber world. And therefore, India's approach should be to actually start building up the security part of 5G before 5G is rolled out. And even if that delays 5G, it's okay, because it's more important to have a robust foundation than to build up a building with no foundation, which is guaranteed to come down like a house of cards. And that's where Australia and India can potentially work together. You know, if you look at it from Australia's perspective, research after research shows that Australia is short of skills. And Australia has a technology, but Australia is short of skills. India, on the other hand, has a large number of skills available, but we need to put it in a framework and provide appropriate funding for that framework to enable that these skills are geared towards towards providing cybersecurity in the post 5G world. And that's where I strongly believe that India and Australia can immediately start collaborating. And in fact, there has been agreements put into place where India and Australia is supposed to collaborate in the area of cybersecurity. And that's absolutely important at this point in time.
Yeah, look, I think that's really interesting and very important to note that cyber and 5G is not just a capability for a digital economy, but also a vulnerability that poses its own risks for management. Now, we're in a world currently that is defined by multipolarity as opposed to unipolarity and a struggling multilateralism. There's been a lot of call for multilateral reform and increasing angst about whether or not a multilateral system can continue to provide for a multipolar world, both in a trade space, but also in a security space. If we think about the internet, both servicing trade and economy as well as security, what are the types of global mechanisms first? And then separately, we'll go into the bilateral relationship, Australia-India. But at the global level, I understand at the United Nations level, we have the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is an interesting UN body because it has not only 193 member states, but also more than 700 sector members as well. So given that hopefully breadth of skill set in addition to global buy-in from multiple countries, could this be the ideal platform for a framework for cybersecurity? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
So, IT has been very successful in actually providing a harmonized telecommunication network which works globally. So you can make a call from Sydney to Iceland and the call will go through. And that's completely thanks to ITU. It has also been able to allocate spectrums and have a cooperation on allocation of spectrums across the world. And therefore, you have devices that work very smoothly from one country to another country without having interference in the wireless spectrum. So ITU has done an excellent job for which it was created. Now, the logic is that internet is also an international telecommunication infrastructure, and therefore, why shouldn't internet be under the jurisdiction of ITU? And why has internet for a long time been led by ICANN under a contract from the Department of Commerce of US government? And therefore, in a way, it can be interpreted that internet was being controlled by the US government. And therefore, the questions of technological sovereignty starts coming up, which is something I've been talking about for a decade and a half. Therefore, it seems to be logical that why don't we move the internet to the ITU? But there is a significant difference between the internet and any other telecommunication mechanism, because the internet also controls content, whereas telecommunication infrastructure is only focused on connecting people. It doesn't have in its jurisdiction on the content itself. Now, that's what makes internet very, very different from a telecommunication network. And the fear is that if internet is being managed by ITU, then the influences of all the member countries starts creeping in. And not all the member countries believe in the same way of life that you and us have, that Australia and India believe in. Not everybody believes in the rule of law, which is why we are very worried about the way 5G will be used, which is what you were asking a little while ago. And that fear of how 5G gets used can also be, or 5G can be used to compromise other people's network, also creeps into how the internet will get governed once it moves into ITU. Because if the value systems of various countries are different, if we are not able to have free speech on the internet, then a large purpose of the internet starts getting compromised. If we are not able to hear the voices of the oppressed people in Tibet, or the oppressed Uyghur Muslims, and the other oppressed people globally, then the internet starts getting compromised and it starts losing its effectiveness. The other large point, Tanya, is that what are we really fixing? Is the internet broken right now? Is there any serious issue that we are facing right now? Is there any particular reason why we would believe that US has compromised the way internet is working? There have been small insinuations here and there. But in the larger framework, we continue to have a pretty free internet out there. And if it's not broken, then why experiment a change institutional mechanism? ICANN itself went through a change in terms of moving from the control of the US government to becoming a multi-stakeholder organization. And even there, we have an issue that if I look at the voting members of ICANN, there isn't a single Indian person out there. And therefore, the question arises that are the views of India getting reflected on ICANN? But then again, the point is that if we are not really having any problems on the ground, then perhaps ICANN is working in a manner that's acceptable to all of us. It's only when it gets broken that we need to start looking at how the institution needs to be changed. And on the other hand, if you look at the United Nations per se, we have seen that United Nations has not really been able to stop many of the conflicts that's happening globally. What has stopped is large global conflicts. And as I was saying jokingly earlier, that the large conflicts did not happen more because of the nuclear bomb rather than the United Nations. So perhaps the nuclear bomb is a good candidate for Nobel Peace Prize than the United Nations itself. And the reason I'm stating that is because if it's not able to control the bilateral conflicts and the smaller conflicts that is strewn across the world, then how is United Nations really geared to protect the freedom that we right now enjoy on the internet?
No, it's a really good analogy, and it just made me think. I mean, you make the nuclear analogy, and you talk about both global and national security. You also talked about how, in this particular context, it might not be appropriate to have a multilateral agreement, but a multi-party agreement could be more appropriate. I'm thinking now of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the NPT that is governed, I guess, in a multi-party way by nuclear powers or exporters of nuclear power, to ensure that there are rules for using nuclear energy so that it's not being used for illicit purposes or, nefarious purposes. Could there be a similar multi-party arrangement, and is that what you're suggesting, among 5G capable countries, so that you might end up, say, having a Finland or a Sweden, given Nokia and Ericsson, US and China, perhaps India, come together governing 5G in a multi-party way?
We need to differentiate between, again, what 5G is and internet is. 5G is an infrastructure, right? And what we really are trying to say is that we need to have freedom over what goes over that infrastructure. And two, that infrastructure should not be used as a mechanism for warfare by either state actors or by non-state actors.
So the point was exactly what you were saying before, that the vulnerability comes in where you're building in vulnerabilities into the network infrastructure at the beginning, which is why you can't retrofit security afterwards, correct?
That is correct. And if somebody wants to do it with a malified intention, the governing body cannot do much about it. What we want to do is, at an institutional level, compromises should not happen. For example, countries should not be able to stop their citizens from having free speech, which is where ICANN has moved on to multi-stakeholderism, which does not involve governments, because the stakeholder of ICANN is not governments, it's actually people. As an Indian, I don't want the government to control what I'm going to say. And the Indian government is a very, very free and rule-based government that we fortunately have. But that's not true with all other countries. And that's where having ICANN under a multi-stakeholderism where the stakeholders are non-governmental in nature, becomes very critical. On the other hand, 5G, being a infrastructure play, still has to be under ITU, but we need to make sure that 5G does not have malwares embedded in it by the vendors, either under the instructions of state actors or under the instructions of non-state actors. And those malwares can have extremely debilitating implications in the nations where they are rolled out. And that's what we really need to protect ourselves from.
Sure. So finally now drilling down to the bilateral relationship, and you touched on this at the beginning of our conversation. Our Prime Ministers met at the beginning of this month, and one of the many agreements they signed during that virtual summit was an Australia-India framework arrangement on cyber and cyber-enabled critical technologies cooperation, which includes 5G, but also quantum AI and a series of other 21st century technologies. And this comes with a $12.7 million fund for cooperation, but more importantly for security. The purpose is to work together to promote exactly what you've been talking about, which is a free, open and safe and secure internet, so that we can have freedom of speech, freedom of use, freedom of commerce, and to enhance digital trade and harness those critical technology opportunities for mutual benefit and mutual prosperity. You touched on Australia-India complementarities before, including skills and the need for skills in this area. Could you explain the significance of bilateral cooperation between our two trusted states, either from a trust relationship perspective or perhaps the regional significance of Australia and India working together in the Indo-Pacific?
I think, as I mentioned earlier also, is that Australia does have a shortage of skilled people. It has the technology, it has got a shortage of skilled people. And India does have the skilled people in place and who can be trained and retrained in the area of cybersecurity. Also keep in mind that the agreement on cyber and critical technologies also included quantum technology. It included IoT and artificial intelligence. So it was not just cyber. And the reason why the other pieces are important is because cyber has become all pervasive. Imagine if your artificial intelligence gets compromised. It will be a massive implication if that AI is being used for areas of managing critical infrastructure and so on and so forth. And therefore, a very close cooperation between CERT India and CERT Australia becomes extremely important, so that the response time is cut down massively. There is already a cooperation framework put into place, but that needs to be upscaled quite significantly to enable a much more closer cooperation between the cyber security organizations of Australia and cyber security organizations of India. In addition, there needs to be a whole bunch of new technologies that needs to be created. As I mentioned, that cyber is now a new theater of conflict. In fact, new is also not the right word, because it's been a theater of conflict now for over a decade and a half. And hence, when the new technologies such as quantum computing come in, the new technologies such as 5G come in, do we have the fundamental security technologies to be able to roll these new dimensions of cyber into our societies, which is where we really need the brain power of Australia and India combined, and the money power of Australia and India combined, to be able to create the fundamental security technology layers to be able to adopt the next generation of cyber technologies, which is where it becomes extremely important to have the agreement that you just referred to. Also, do keep in mind that when this agreement was being signed, which is Australia-India Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership Agreement, along with it, there were also other agreements related to defense that were signed. In fact, there were 2 or 3 defense agreements that were signed along with the Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership Agreement, which just shows that the expectation of this agreement is more from a national security perspective, and not just from a day-to-day antivirus security kind of an issue. It's a much larger issue that both the governments are trying to address, and therefore this agreement needs to be seen from a geopolitical and a geosecurity perspective.
I completely agree with you. Just in closing, because we've covered a lot, and I take your point completely that the framework agreement covers all manner of things like artificial intelligence, IoT, quantum computing, once that takes off, and a number of other issues, which can be all pervasive. I mean, these things can manage our crops, our transport networks, fintech, digital health, location technologies. It's all pervasive. So just in closing, I wanted to ask you from a regulatory perspective, and you may not have the answer to this, but what would be one of the top 2 or 3 principles that governments need to be thinking about? Because I think one of the most challenging things about this area is that the technical expertise often is not within the bureaucracies that are doing the regulation or the governance. So are there some core 2 or 3 principles that at the very outset governments need to be considering when governing this space?
That's a very difficult proposition from a government perspective, because as we all know, the regulations and the technologies lag behind, so regulations and the policies lag behind technology. And also, if you look at the recent cyber attack that happened on the Australian government, which reportedly was a state-backed attack, how would an internal regulation really help such an attack to be prevented? And those regulations could be in terms of how companies manage their cyber systems, because the attack could come in from any network possible. It could be from a corporate network. It could be from any other network which is being used within the country, and that could be used to actually infiltrate high-value targets within the country. And therefore, the regulations needs to be actually a step ahead moving forward, because we can't afford to have a situation where there is a large impact of a cyber attack that happens in a nation because the regulations were not in place, because the regulations were lagging behind. So it's extremely important to put the regulations in place, but it's always very challenging because you need to have a balance between security and ease of doing business, and even within business there are conflicting requirements. For example, a bank would require a high level of encryption, whereas government would require an ability to have a legal snooping, if I could call it, on certain communication in the interest of the security of the country. So security and ease of business at some point in time starts getting conflicted, and to be able to have a public debate, to be able to come out with a balanced regulation is not a simple task to do. So it is a big ask, it's challenging, but I totally agree that we need to have the regulations in place before the next generation of technologies come in, because they can easily be exploited to infiltrate a nation's way of life, and we don't want that way of life to be compromised.
Thank you so much for your time. I think this has demonstrated both the power of your experience and your intellect, Jaijit. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, but also just how vast the topic is. For now, I'm really pleased that Australia and India are partnering in this space. It demonstrates not only our skills, technology complementarity, but I think an even more increased trust within the relationship that will stand us in very good stead moving forward in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having this conversation.